Hello, and thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report on NTD television. I'm Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we've been covering for you today. The Democrat-controlled House today passed a new bill. They say it's an investment in American manufacturing, keeping up with China and addressing climate change. But there's a lingering question. How are Democrats planning to work with China on climate change while trying to stand up to the regime's ongoing genocides? Following the riots resulting from the killing of George Floyd in 2020, many prominent Democrats were calling to defund the police. Now violent crime has skyrocketed, and President Biden is making calls for more funding for the police. Tennessee Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger tells us what she thinks needs to be done. The U.S. jobs market got an unexpected boost in January, in spite of the rapid spread of Omicron throughout the country. But there are still some concerns about inflation and the overall trend of the economy. On Capitol Hill today, the Democrat-controlled House passed the Competes Act. Our reporter Melina Wisecup has the details on this. So Melina, one Democrat, Congresswoman Murphy, voted against this, and one Republican, Representative Kingsinger, joined Democrats voting to pass it. What can you tell us?
So the lack of Republican support on this bill comes as no surprise. We've heard from House Republicans all week that they are opposed to this bill. That some of them are even calling it the America Concedes Act because they say it doesn't do enough to challenge China and be tough on China. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because it invests so much in American innovation, technology, and manufacturing, but it doesn't take any extra steps or provide any extra guardrails for protecting that new intellectual property from being stolen from Chinese Communist Party spies. And that has been an ongoing issue in our universities. Now, another thing about this bill is that it does include some of those Build Back Better provisions, specifically the climate change proposals. That may be because the Senate right now has stalled that Build Back Better bill. So with that piece of the Biden agenda stalled, House Democrats took this opportunity and included some of those climate change pieces in this America Competes Act. Now, the bill actually calls for increased cooperation with China to address climate change, while at the same time trying to crack down on them for their human rights abuses. Now, earlier this week, I asked Speaker Pelosi how they can balance this relationship. How can you try to increase cooperation with China while at the same time trying to hold them accountable for human rights? Here's how she responded. How can you ensure that while increasing that cooperation, you can also be sure that the Chinese Communist Party is taking the sanctions in Xinjiang seriously and not try to get around those sanctions?
Well, we are very serious about the Uyghur legislation that we passed in a bipartisan way. We'll have the funding to fund our follow-up on checking on what companies might be using products coming from prison labor camps. So again, we cannot say, because we hope you'll do something on climate, that we can ignore the fact that you're committing genocide of a population in your country. That's just not going to happen.
But this week, the speaker has faced some backlash for telling athletes not to speak out against the CCP while at the Olympics, warning them, quote, "Do not risk incurring the anger of the Chinese government because they are ruthless."
So, Melina, it appears that this bill might address necessary investments in the domestic economy, like producing semiconductor chips that we've heard so much about lately. What's the next step here?
Well, Steve, as we know, just because the House passed it doesn't mean it's a done deal. The fight is not over. This bill still has to go over to the Senate side and garner enough Republican support to get it to Biden's desk. Now, I do expect that this House version of the bill will change quite a bit. For example, some of those climate change provisions may have to be stripped out or minimized in order to get enough Republican support to pass it in the Senate. But ultimately, I expect those more domestic areas to stay in the bill, such as the CHIPS Act, because we know that that will help the production with our those computer chips that have a shortage right now, as well as the investments in the education part of it, trying to invest more in that education to create more innovation and technology. I expect that will also stay in, but ultimately, I think we're going to see a very strong and genuine bipartisan discussion on this, and ultimately the bill will get to Biden's desk in some shape or form, because I think this is something that both parties really see as crucial to our economy and global competitiveness. Steve, back to you.
Thanks for that, Melina. In the wake of rising gun violence throughout the country, President Biden visited New York City yesterday to double down on his support for the police, effectively distancing himself from Democrats who've advocated for defunding the police. We spoke to Tennessee Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger to get her take on rising violence throughout the country and what the focus needs to be on. Congresswoman Diana Harshbarger, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Yes, my pleasure.
Now, Congresswoman, right now there's so many issues that the U.S. is facing. We have the Russia-Ukraine, China. Domestically, we have inflation, gun violence. So many different things are plaguing the country and challenging the country right now. What do you think America's key focus should be?
Well, it's restoring law and order, and you know there are a plethora of things you can choose from to talk about. And every day I wake up and there's something new. You know, inflation hurts everyone. Everyone goes to the grocery store, everyone buys gas, and they've seen a steep increase in what they pay. And if I'm not mistaken, it's another $3,600 out of their pocket because inflation, you know, in taxation, it's unbelievable what people are coming to me and saying, help us in any way you can.
Now, Congresswoman, you mentioned law and order. Yesterday, President Biden was in New York City, raising the concern of rising gun violence throughout the country. What do you think the cause of this is, and what is the solution?
Well, the cause is lawlessness breeds lawlessness, and when you don't equip your police departments or your sheriff departments with what they need to combat that, or you won't let them do their job, you're going to breed lawlessness, and that's what's happened. If you do not, we don't need more laws. We just need to use the laws on the books and make sure that, you know, we convict these criminals that are already out there. If they think they can do it, they will do it. Just like the $900. If it's less than $900 in California, what do? They smash and grab until somebody puts the price up at $901 to where they have to go and take them to court and try to convict them. It's unbelievable. People will do what they think they can get away with, and that's what's happening in our societies. And these are democratically run cities and states where you see it's happening. You don't see that happening back in my area in East Tennessee because they go after those that break the law. And we don't need more rules. We just need to enforce the ones we have on the books.
Now, yesterday, President Biden called for unity based on America's common values. What are America's common values to you?
It should be allow us to live without government intervention. That's it. When I talk to people, for example, homeschoolers, they're like, look, we don't mind to pay the taxes for these public schools, but just don't mess with us. Let us live our lives. Don't interfere. Don't even give us tax credits, for example, because we know there's going to be strings attached. Let them live their lives. You know, I tell people all the time, if the government comes knocking, just don't answer the door because we don't need their help. You know, when they enable people, you know, we're not a productive society, and we've seen that during COVID when they allowed people to stay at home and you pay them to do so. That's, you know, the labor shortage is driving the disruption in the supply chains, for example. It's just, we don't need a lot of government intervention. They're just there to protect us from, you know, foreign adversaries, but let us live our lives because we know best.
Beijing 2022 Olympic Games have just kicked off inside of communist China. What kind of message do you think it sends when the International Olympic Committee rewards this communist regime with another Olympics?
Oh, it's just a slap in the face. You see the genocide that's going on with the Uyghurs. You see some of the stories I've heard out of China. It's unbelievable, unbelievable. There's no respect for human life. There's no respect for their own people. You know, it's all a numbers game and the power. And what they're doing, you know, these athletes do not know how they're going to track them. We know that they will track them. They have to have a specific app on their phone. We don't know. I fear for their safety and security, and our government should be alarmed about that as well. And that's something I'll do a floor speech on later. We don't know. We need to protect those athletes. If this administration, if the Biden administration is going to allow them to participate in those games, you know, they better protect them because anything said that is deterrent from that Chinese government or the CCP, they're going to arrest them, and who knows what will happen. They get rid of their own people when they speak up. which is sad, which is very sad. Don't reward them, punish them is the way I look at it.
Congresswoman Harshbarger, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The U.S. economy has added more jobs than expected. That's according to a report released today by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics.
Our country is taking everything that COVID has to throw at us, and we've come back stronger. I'm pleased to report this morning, but many of you already know, that America's job machine is going stronger than ever.
Biden touted that the economy added 467,000 jobs last month. That's 2 times higher than the Dow Jones predicted. And overall, 6.6 million jobs were created over the last 12 months. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate in January inched up from 3.9% to 4%, the first increase in the jobless rate since June 2021. However, Republican Senator Mike Lee said that inflation is eating away people's paychecks even if they have jobs. And economist Steve Moore is concerned about the recent overall slowdown of the economy.
So we're seeing a reduction in industrial production. We're seeing less capital spending by our businesses. We already have high inflation, and we don't want growth to stall out because that would lead to stagflation.
This afternoon, Biden visited Maryland, where he met with union workers. He signed an executive order which aims to boost the rights of workers in unions in their negotiations for federal construction projects.
There are going to be thousands of people put to work.
The administration says it will speed up building times and benefit 200,000 construction workers.
These union contracts can inflate the cost of these programs by 25 or 30%. And that means, we have less money available then to build new roads and to repair the roads and bridges that we already have.
Moore said that he wants workers to be well paid, but that Biden is more eager to make the unions happy rather than getting the infrastructure safe and modernized. President Biden's nominees for the Federal Reserve are in agreement that the Fed needs to tackle inflation. The nominees told the Senate Banking Committee Thursday that fighting inflation should be the Fed's top priority. Biden picked Lisa Cook and Philip Jefferson to fill open seats on the Fed's Board of Governors.
Every day, Americans are suffering from high inflation.
The Fed must take steps to bring inflation back in line with its targets.
Inflation is running 2.5 times higher than what the Fed anticipated. The panel's set to vote on all 5 of Biden's nominees on February 15th. That includes the renomination of Fed Chair Jerome Powell. The Senate will take their vote shortly after. The Senate Judiciary Committee voted on Thursday to advance an antitrust bill that targets big tech. The bipartisan bill addresses Apple and Google in particular. The new legislation is an attempt to curtail the power of the 2 tech giants. Google and Apple have a monopoly of the App Store market and exert vast control over information and capital on the Internet. The bill is sponsored by Senators Richard Blumenthal, Amy Klobuchar, and Marsha Blackburn. The committee voted 20-2 to advance the legislation, with Senators John Cornyn and Tom Tillis being the only dissenting votes. Congress is addressing the controversies around 5G service near U.S. airports. Testimony was heard Thursday from the head of the FAA. Since Verizon and AT&T turned on the network last month, dozens of flights have been canceled amid concerns that 5G signals would interfere with key instruments on planes, causing safety concerns. The Federal Aviation Administration has cleared 90% of the nation's airline fleet to land during poor visibility at airports near 5G cell towers. FAA Administrator Stephen Dixon said a permanent fix for the problem is at least 1 year out. Chairman of the House Transportation Committee, Peter DeFazio, blamed the Federal Communications Commission for approving 5G.
Because we cannot have conflicting industries. Having a dropped call is way less serious than having a dropped airplane out of the sky.
The FCC claimed that 40 other countries have launched 5G services without any reports of radio interference to aircraft. The U.S. alleges Russia is plotting a false flag operation on Ukraine, but Ukraine has a different interpretation. State-sponsored forced live organ harvesting against your own citizens. The evidence and pressure is mounting against the CCP as another United States member of Congress is speaking out. This as the Beijing Winter Games are fraught with human rights abuses. Several leading scientists changed their minds after initially believing that the CCP virus leaked from a lab in China. A group of top Republican lawmakers asked them to explain why under oath. Hello and welcome back to NTD's Capital Report. Ukraine tensions are not going away. The U.S. accuses Russia of creating a fake conflict in order to invade Ukraine.
The Russian government, we think, is planning to stage a fake attack by Ukrainian military or intelligence forces against Russian sovereign territory or against Russian-speaking people to therefore justify their action.
But Russian diplomats are pushing back.
I can assure you that Russia is never involved in any business of this kind. And there is no reason, logically speaking, that that might be taking place.
However, the Ukraine doesn't agree with the U.S.'s assessment.
So we have the same facts, but the different perception or different estimation.
Russia has continued building up forces along Ukraine's borders, but the number of armed forces is about the same as last spring.
On this day, Russian didn't formate the striking forces. That's it. But the risk or threats we have still.
The U.S. Department of Homeland Security on Thursday announced a new cybersecurity review board. DHS announced that at President Biden's direction, the Cybersecurity Board will assess past events and drive improvements across private and public sectors. Leading the Cybersecurity Board will be Undersecretary for Policy Robert Silvers. The board will issue recommendations to both government and private sectors on how to better protect U.S. networks and cyber infrastructure. Communist China is suspected of hacking the media conglomerate News Corporation. News Corp, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, is the parent company of the Wall Street Journal and Fox News. The hackers compromised data and accounts of employees, including journalists, in late January. The vice president of Mandiant, the cybersecurity company hired by News Corp, said that the hackers were likely involved in espionage activities to collect intelligence on behalf of China. A limited number of employee email accounts from News Corp headquarters, Dow Jones, and the New York Post may have been affected. Over the years, the Chinese regime has frequently been accused of hacking into the accounts of journalists. For years, with their modern skylines and ability to entice foreign investment, the CCP has been able to deceive the world into thinking China's rise has been peaceful. Ohio Congressman Steve Chabot is not deceived, and we're happy to have him on to discuss. Congressman Steve Chabot, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Happy to do it.
Now, Congressman, the Olympics just began in Beijing with serious concerns of genocide taking place in China. Former Assistant Secretary of State Robert Destro recently told the Epoch Times he believes there are at least 3 genocides taking place in China. With that said, how have NBC Universal, the IOC, and many other major corporations been able to justify going headfirst into business with the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah, it's outrageous. It really is. And the International Olympic Committee should be embarrassed. In picking the PRC, China in the first place, when you consider their grotesque human rights abuses over the years, and then not moving it to a more appropriate location. They really ought to be ashamed. And essentially, the International Olympic Committee has been an apologist for China. And we've seen, no question, gross human rights abuses towards the Uyghurs, the Falun Gong, the Tibetans, the people of Hong Kong. It just goes on. And this should have been changed. Unfortunately, they're moving ahead with it.
Now, Congressman, the CCP cares about public perception and saving its face almost more than anything. How might they react if some of these Olympians take matters into their own hands and show solidarity to one of these persecuted groups that you just mentioned on the world stage?
Well, unfortunately, many countries like the United States, we're used to freedom of speech, and that's just not the case in China. It hasn't been for a long time, and certainly is not now. And in fact, Olympians, athletes from all over the world have been warned that if they speak out, they may well be punished for that. One has no idea to what extent the PRC may go with that punishment, too. We've seen Peng Shui, what happened to her when she spoke out over being sexually abused by a high Chinese official. What happened to her? She disappeared. We actually saw it in our community. I happen to represent Cincinnati, Ohio, in Congress, and we had a young man, a college student, Otto Warmbier. Many Americans might remember what happened to him. He was in North Korea, and because of a minor poster incident, he was imprisoned, and then his parents got him back in a vegetative state, essentially brain dead. And of course, we know that North Korea is essentially the partner state to China. And so it's very dangerous, I think, for our athletes. And it's unfortunate that athletes who are used to freedom of speech, enjoying that in their own country, have to be extremely worried and very careful in China. And we know that China is also, it's been called an Orwellian surveillance state, and it certainly is.
Now, you've co-sponsored a bill to address live forced organ harvesting against Falun Gong practitioners. What does the world need to know about this crime, and what does your bill aim to do?
It's horrendous. It's barbaric to consider in modern times. China is actually taking people's organs involuntarily. Many of these people are Falun Gong participants and essentially against their will, and then selling their organs for profit. This has been well documented. There's been the China Tribunal report that came out not long ago. There have been books written on this. We know it's happening. Of course, the PRC denies it, but it's happening, and they're making money on this. And it's barbaric to consider something like that is going on in modern times.
Now, overseas and internationally, how dangerous are the CCP's attempts at soft power, and what can be done to combat this subtle strategy that the CCP has been using?
Well, sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're not so subtle. We've seen them, for example, build islands in the South China Sea and then militarize them. We've seen them threaten many of their neighbors. There's about 7 countries right now that they literally claim their territory. We've seen the tremendous pressure and provocative actions towards Taiwan, for example. And it just goes on. And I think those neighbor countries, have to be very wary. So what we need to do is we need to work with our allies in the region, and we need to counter China's terribly bad behavior, because unfortunately, it could end up with military action. That's the last thing that we want to see. But it's similar right now to Russia on Ukraine's border. We see things that we certainly hate seeing in modern times, but they're occurring.
Congressman Steve Chabot, thank you.
Thank you.
Top members of Congress are calling on 7 leading scientific experts who privately, through emails, supported the theory that the CCP virus originated from a laboratory, but then took a different public stance. House Oversight Committee member James Comer, joined by Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan, are calling on a group of 7 leading scientists to answer questions under oath. The congressmen want to know why these leading scientists changed their minds after meeting with top government health officials, including Dr. Fauci. In a letter the Republican lawmakers wrote, alarmingly, it appears that the decision to suppress the lab leak hypothesis was rooted in political calculations rather than scientific principles. That's all we have for you tonight on the Capitol Report. Thank you for tuning in. From Washington, D.C., I'm Steve Lance. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.